Okay.
Okay, so we're
All
recording.
right.
We'll just keep going. I mean, normally if this was live, of course, we wouldn't be able to pause it and stop it and so on and so
Oh
forth.
yeah,
So
right.
it'd be nice if we just kept going. But if we really, really, like my phone rings, I can't, this is my work phone next to me. It doesn't ring often, but, be typical that it just, something
You
happens.
never know.
You never know. We can obviously,
Yes,
because we're recording this, we can pause it
yes.
and we can deal with it and we can carry on. So
Okay.
anyway. All right, we're ready to go.
Okay.
Okay, good. Hello, Sylvia. Welcome to Tudor Talk. What a pleasure it is to see you in person finally.
Well, hello there, Sarah. I'm so excited to see you and to meet you finally.
I know, because like things are these days, there's oceans between us, I suspect, and we've conversed a lot on email, but we've never actually spoken in person. So this is exciting, I think, for both of us.
Exciting. Yes.
And particularly because of the book you have out. But we'll come to that just in a moment. But maybe for people who don't know you, Sylvia, maybe you would just like to introduce yourself. Tell us where you are in the world, what you do, and how come you're writing books about Tudor history.
Okay, so my name is Sylvia Barbara Soberton. I live in Slovenia, actually.
Not too far then,
um,
not oceans, just landmass.
Not oceans, just yes. So I live in Slovenia. I am a historian, writer, researcher. I specialize in the Tudor period and especially the lives of women. I've debuted in 2015 with the Forgotten Tudor Women series, where I just explore the lives of Tudor women, the lesser known Tudor women, such as, for example, Anne Seymour or Mary Howard. There's a lot of information about them out there, so I really like to kind of discover and explore the lives of these lesser known players at the Tudor court.
Who got you interested in Tudor history? Which Tudor character first sucked you in?
I think you know. It's Anne Boleyn, of course.
I thought you might say that, but
I think it's Anne Boleyn for most of the people, to be honest,
she
because
is.
it's just such a great story.
Yeah, she's a
It
bit of a
has it
poster
all.
girl. She's a bit of a poster girl, isn't
Yeah,
she, for the 16th
I think
century?
so. I
Mm,
think so, yes.
yeah, and
Yes.
I absolutely know that feeling of being
Mm.
sucked in and suddenly you're down the rabbit hole of Tudor history and
Oh, yes, that's true.
and one thing leads to another. And you've just published your most recent book, which I think is, for me, is and I'll tell you why in a moment, is incredibly intriguing.
Hmm.
It's Ladies in Waiting, Women Who Served Anne Boleyn. So of course we can see the link, your love of Anne Boleyn and your love for
Hmm.
talking about Tudor women and putting Tudor women centre stage. Is there any
Yes.
particular story though about why this particular book at this time?
Yes, well, I've been fascinated with Anne Boleyn for more than 10 years now. And uh, we usually explore Anne Boleyn's life through their relationships with men. So, with Henry VIII, who was her royal suitor, her husband, through the relationship she had with her brother and with her father, and the men who were executed as her alleged lovers in 1536. But we rarely see the women in her story, and the women surrounded her on a daily basis. And they were present also in the narrative of her downfall. So I wanted to just kind of explore the lives of women who served Anne, why they were important in her story, what relationships she had with them. Because when we think about Anne, I think many people just imagine that she was surrounded by men because, of course, Henry VIII's court was a male preserve, but Anne was surrounded by women and they knew her secrets, they knew everything about her. So I was very fascinated with that. And I'm also very fascinated with ladies in waiting in general, like what the life was like for them. So I really wanted to get to that other side of it, of the story, and not retell Anne's story from this, usual angle, kind of a biography, but through women, because that's what I do. I explore the women's lives and I find them very fascinating.
Well, Sylvia, I totally applaud you and I can completely understand your interest in doing this, and I applaud your determination to bring the women who, as you say, are there often in the background, bringing them right centre stage into the
Exactly.
rise, the triumph, and the fall of Anne Boleyn. And the
Mm-hmm.
reason I particularly feel a connection to this was the first time I began to see these women emerge from the shadows was when I was researching my novel about Anne Boleyn, Le Temps Viendra. And of course, it's impossible to write a novel without talking about the women who were around her. And I know that by learning about these women, it coloured in the detail of Anne's life so much more than I had anticipated, and how fascinating they were in their own right. And I'm sure you found this yourself. When you understand all this plethora of connections of people Anne influenced and people who influenced her, you can start to make some really interesting insights, can't you, about how events unfolded. And so I guess
Yes,
that is my question
exactly.
to you. Before we dive in, and we're going to talk about some of the individual women you focus on in the book, looking back as a whole at this whole project of researching and writing this book, what was your overall experience? What maybe surprised you or delighted you in researching and writing this book?
Well, so first of all, I was very fascinated when I've discovered that there is a document in the British Library. And this document lists the ladies in waiting who took part in Anne Boleyn's coronation in 1533. And I was so fascinated because when I looked at that document, I knew the names of the women. And I thought, wow, we can actually not only see them accompanying Anne Boleyn on this very important event, but we can see them in her household because there are various documents such as household accounts, chronicles, memoirs, and so on that place these women in Anne Boleyn's household. So they were at court with her. And I thought that this document was very interesting to explore, to help me identify the women who served Anne. And that was really kind of this eureka moment for me when I was like, wow, I can actually identify the women who served Anne. And some of the names were obvious because we know them very well from the narrative of Anne's life and death, but others were not so well known. So I wanted really to kind of bring their stories to light, I guess. So yeah, that document was the highlight, I think, and the centerpiece, of course, of the book.
Yes. So, I mean, I've got so many questions are bubbling up. I sort of want to ask you. Let me ask you this first before I forget. I'm really keen to know, of all the people that you wrote about, who kind of interested you or intrigued you or you learnt the most about, do you think?
So I really wanted, like, Gertrude Courtenay, Marchioness of Exeter. No brainer here. Oh my gosh, she's such a fascinating character. And I wrote actually a biography of her too. But how it happened, how I wrote her biography, it was because I met her writing this book. So I really wanted to go further and explore her role and in Anne's household, but also in this general story of Henry VIII's great matter, the divorce, because she was, this kind of a political player, very important person, but surprisingly not very often mentioned, or maybe mentioned, but her life story is not very often covered in detail. And I think that's a pity because she was amazing. Maybe I don't think I could be her friend because I think she was very, kind of plotting and just lurking in the background, talking to ambassadors, appearing in disguise on his
Mm-hmm.
doorstep.
Mm.
But she was fascinating in a way that she was not afraid to. just play the game, this political
Yeah.
game, to be the supporter of Catherine of Aragon and Lady Mary, and to be the enemy of Anne Boleyn. Because when we think about ladies in waiting, we usually think about the relationships that that were friendships.
Mm.
But with Gertrude and Anne Boleyn, it's hatred.
Mm.
Basically, it's hatred,
Mm.
because Gertrude, she was very supportive and loyal of Catherine of Aragon and Lady Mary, and that's because her father was a chamberlain in the household of Catherine of Aragon, and he also married, as one of his four wives, Inez de Venegas, who was Spanish lady in waiting of Catherine of Aragon. And this lady, she died pretty early on in the marriage, so they weren't married for a long time. But she was, for a brief spell, a stepmother to Gertrude.
Mm.
And I think that also added to Gertrude's sense of loyalty to Catherine of Aragon and Catherine's household.
Mm.
And so we have this kind of a lot of evidence that Gertrude, she hated Anne Boleyn. She was conservative, where Anne was a reformer. These families, the Courtenays and the Poles, they met
Mm.
often. They talked about politics, and we know how it ended for them, because the Exeter conspiracy unfolded in 1538, and most of these people who were involved in these conversations throughout the 1530s were later executed. And that was also a great scandal, this kind of bloody coup, similar to what happened to Anne Boleyn in 1536. Yes.
Yes.
So,
What,
yeah.
what goes around comes around. No, I mean, that's
Oh,
really,
I guess.
yeah, you see that far too
Well,
often in the Tudor history, don't you? But that's really
oh, yes.
interesting because I don't, I mean, obviously, again, this actually, Gertrude is somebody that I've definitely heard the name of, but I haven't plotted, I haven't gone deep, I haven't spent time with her. So
Mhm.
that's really interesting. Maybe we should just take a step back and maybe you could describe to people when they buy your book, what are they going to see within it? How have you structured the book? And why did you decide to do
Mhm.
it that way?
Okay. So I like to tell the story chronologically, because I feel it gives readers this kind of immersive feeling, and they feel like they are with Anne Boleyn every step of the way. So in the beginning, it's Anne's, basically the beginning of her career at court. She was maid of honor to Catherine of Aragon, and just how she became Henry VIII's love interest, and how they exchanged love letters, and who served Anne Boleyn before she became queen, so
Mm.
before the year 1533, how many servants she had. And of course, the evidence here is a little bit patchy, because we don't have the full list of ladies in waiting who served Anne before she became queen. But there are names, and there are women who served her, and I will get to that in a bit. Then, of course, 1533, the coronation, so the list of ladies in waiting that I mentioned. And then, of course, the year 1534, 1535, and of course 1536. So when it comes to 1536, I've discussed the roles of ladies in waiting who were said to have stepped forward with the damning accusations against
Mm-hmm.
Anne, because that's what Thomas Cromwell tells us
Mm-hmm.
in the letters. That's what also the many accounts tell us, that the women were
Oh,
responsible for.
can you believe that? That's just, I told you, it never rings. Just let me pause
I
this.
know.
Just let me
I know.
pause this. You. Okay, do you want to take it from
Okay.
1536? You say, and then we get to 1536, and maybe we could pick it up from there.
Okay. So in 1536, where we know that the ladies in waiting, according to Cromwell and other sources, stepped forward with the damning accusations against Anne. And in between 1533 and 1536, I've just went with it and explored the relationships Anne had with various women from her household, whether they were her friends or enemies, and how it all played out, in connection to the well-known story of Anne's life.
Well, that's the sad bit. Let's leave
Oh
that
yeah.
to the end, and let's focus on
Okay.
happier times. And the first, because what I thought we'd do now is really dive into some of the women
Okay.
and really unravel their stories a little bit and see if we can get to know them and decide, as you would say, whether we'd like to be friends with them or not, spend
Oh.
time with them or not. Um, and one of the earliest ones you talk about that captured my attention was Anne Gainsford, because she's somebody in Le Temps
Oh
Viendra
yeah.
I choose to have as a very good friend and supporter of Anne right from the beginning. And as you say, she's one of the, I think, the few people who we do definitely know was there from one of the earliest times. So I know what I think about Anne, but I want you to tell us about Anne Gainsford. You know, who is she? How was she involved with Anne from such an early stage in Anne's kind of appearance at court? And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, kind of we'll unpack it from there. Did you like her?
Mm-hmm.
Let's see what you've got to say.
You know what? Anne Gainsford is, as you said, she's the name that pops out, pops
Mm,
out,
yeah.
um, on the pages of Anne Boleyn's story, because she is always mentioned in Anne Boleyn's household, and I wanted to know if there's more to know about her, and turns out there is one thing that historians always say about her, which is a myth.
Mm,
So how do we know that she was close to Anne? Well, there there is this story that Anne Boleyn borrowed her a book, William Tyndale's The Obedience of the Christian Man. And as we know, Tyndale's books were proscribed. They were, because Tyndale was translating the Bible and Henry VIII didn't like it, and his books were heretical basically. And Anne Boleyn, as we know, she read Tyndale. She had Tyndale's Bible later in her time as queen,
mm,
but also she read The Obedience of a Christian Man, and she kind of highlighted the passages that she thought were relevant to perhaps her own advantage, to show to Henry VIII that, you know, basically kings were not did not owe obedience to the popes,
mm,
and of course we can see why that was heretical in many people's eyes. And Anne Gainsford also read that book, and we know that her suitor George Zouche, he playfully snatched it from her when she was reading it, and it was kind of a part of a, you know, this playful courtship between
mm,
Tudor people, you know, snatching books, jewels, and all
mhm,
sorts of things.
mm,
um, and at one time, Cardinal Wolsey learned that this book was being read in Anne's household, that her women were involved, and he basically, you know, brought this book to Henry VIII's attention, and uh, nothing happened. Anne wasn't punished for it, and Gainsford wasn't punished for it. But this anecdote, it sheds a light on Anne Boleyn's relationship with Anne Gainsford. But it's just, you know, this little, I would say, snippet
mm,
of evidence, and
mm,
we don't really have much more about Anne Gainsford or her relationship with Anne.
mm,
Uh, George Wyatt, the grandson of
mm,
poet Thomas Wyatt, wrote his book about Anne Boleyn in 1606, and it's first biography of Anne Boleyn ever written. And George Wyatt says that his informants were two women, and that one of them was Anne Boleyn's servant before and after Anne became queen. And Samuel Weller Singer, who was the 19th century editor of Wyatt's work, he identified this lady from Anne's household as Anne Gainsford. And why did he do it? Well, precisely because there was this anecdote circulating about Anne Gainsford reading Anne
mhm,
Boleyn's book,
mhm.
The
Yeah.
Obedience of the
So
Christian
he
Man.
made the connection.
And he made a connection, and nobody has ever questioned that. You know, how was this connection made? Why is it true? Because as Anne Boleyn's most prominent biographers, Eric Ives, pointed out, if Wyatt was really interviewing Anne Gainsford, then it's kind of disappointing what he wrote in his book, because there isn't really that much of, you know, kind of private information about
Mm,
Anne, or it's basically what we know about Anne, just from a little bit maybe different perspective. But basically, I think that Wyatt had perhaps little help of informants, or
mm,
maybe he was repeating what was known about Anne at the time, just in general terms, because what he amassed is really very disappointing. It's really a short book, nothing new really, and the timeline is also muddled. So he made mistakes. And so, how did I discover that this Anne Gainsford wasn't really his informant? Well, he died before George Wyatt was even born. So that kind of excludes her. She couldn't have been his informant. But it's interesting because it shows that Anne Boleyn's story is subjected to myths. Um, and we think that because something is repeated so many times, that it's true, or that maybe someone else would have discovered if it was a myth already.
Mm.
But I discovered that no matter how many pairs of eyes looks at
Yeah.
Anne Boleyn's story, there's always something new to discover. There's always something new to bring to her story.
Yeah.
When you are questioning things, because of course you have to kind of have an open mind and accept that not everything that you think you know is true. So that was a big one for me. I think I was pretty shocked, I guess, because it's kind of unbalanced story. And there's this anecdote that Wyatt wrote, that because Anne calls to her maid of honor Nan, she says Nan, this uh, shorter form of the name Anne.
Mm.
And that's, I guess, why this Samuel Weller Single, the editor, made the connection.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of Annes in Anne Boleyn's
Yes, there
household,
certainly
and
were.
in that court in generally. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not just one Nan, but she wasn't identified by Wyatt as Anne Gainsford. It was a later invention. So it's very interesting how we think we know something, and then turns out not to be true.
Yeah, you've really got to keep your eyes open, and you're right, there is always new stuff to find, and things do get
Exactly.
repeated. So there's always a sort of you can always see into something. There's often new things lurking there, ready, waiting to be found, and goodness knows what else is waiting to be found. But
Yes.
where did Nan Gainsford come from? Do you know what was her? I mean, it sounds as though their reformist beliefs certainly bound them together. You can imagine they had a common sort of view of the world, which would have made them natural friends. And I suppose by the inference that she was there with Anne from the very earliest days, we have to infer, of
Hmm.
course, that the two of them must have been incredibly close. But I think that's probably about all we do know, isn't it? And I was just interested. I was trying to remember which family Nan came from, Anne Gainsford came
Hmm.
from, and maybe how she got introduced to Anne. I'm not sure we know that,
Uh-huh.
do we?
I would have to check that in my notes, because I don't remember exactly her parentage. Because
Mm,
just because she's not somebody that later appears in Anne Boleyn's story, and I feel like we know only this story about George Wyatt and the obedience of a Christian man. We know that she doesn't appear later on in Anne's story, and that's pretty puzzling for me.
mm,
I think that maybe, like it was the case with some of Anne Boleyn's ladies, they married and had their own households and their own families, and they were pregnant quite a lot of
yeah.
the
Mm,
time. So some women chose to just withdraw from court
mm,
and dedicate their lives, their childbearing years,
mm,
to just raising their children, overseeing their education, and so on and so on. And I
mm.
think that's the case with Anne Gainsford, because there is this source anecdote that says that Bess of Hardwick, the very known Elizabethan figure, that she spent her formative years, her teenage
That's
years, in
right.
the household
That's
of Anne
right.
Gainsford at
Yeah.
Codnor Castle.
Mm,
And so that's a very interesting connection to make as well. And I think um, because Bess was born in the 1520s, towards the end, I think, of the 1520s, that it's true that Anne Gainsford just kind of had her
yeah.
household, her children in it, and that family is like Bess of Hardwick's family wanted to place their kids
Mm,
there with her, because it was a common practice in 16th century England to send your child to the family of your peers to be
mm.
educated there, to learn the manners, to observe. Um,
And
so it's interesting, yeah.
yeah, and the fact that she was sent there maybe does say that although Anne wasn't at court, that she was still seen as a cultured, educated woman who had connections.
Probably so, yes.
Yeah.
I think perhaps there's more to discover about her. There are many women throughout writing this book. I was thinking, wow, I tried to basically, uncover these stories to the best of my abilities. But sometimes it's just frustrating when you don't have any more information. You would like to learn more. You would like to go deeper into the story, and there's nothing there.
Mm,
So that's a little bit frustrating.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think that perhaps with doing archival research, it's possible to uncover these stories. It's possible to learn more, and as we said before, keeping an open mind that nothing is written in stone. Things can change. Our understanding of Anne Boleyn or her household can change at any time.
Mm.
So I think keeping an open mind and doing a lot of research and going into the archives, I think, is crucial here.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to wrap up, Anne, by saying, would you like to be her friend?
I think so. I think so. There's no evidence that she was, plotting, this kind of a person.
Scheming.
So I
Yeah.
think, yeah. So I think she would
Yes.
have been a good friend.
Yeah.
I think so.
Me too. I
Yeah.
always really warmed to Anne. And in fact, I
Yeah.
have her Holbein sketch on my bedroom wall. I was really pleased to be able, the book of stippling engravings that were done. I
Hmm.
managed to buy 2 or 3 of them a few years back. And mind you, it's M. Zouche. Now, we don't know whether it's Lady Zouche
Oh, that
or
one.
Mary
Oh,
Zouche. I think there is
oh.
I just choose to believe it is Anne. So,
um.
because I like it.
Do I burst your bubble or not?
Oh, no, don't say that.
I think the Lady Zouche, the M Zouche,
Mm,
actually, I think it's Mary Zouche.
right.
I
Yeah.
think there. I think it's Mary Zouche because again, she's somebody who appears in Anne Boleyn's household quite a lot. She was present at Anne Boleyn's coronation, and there is this very interesting letter from Mary Zouche also. She basically asked her cousin if he could help her to be placed in the household of Catherine of Aragon or Princess Mary in 1520s, late 1520s. But as we know, Henry VIII was in the process of divorcing Catherine, so I think he placed her directly in Anne Boleyn's household because Anne
Right.
later has her attending her during the coronation, and Mary Sush is also present in Jane Seymour's household. And in 1542, she receives an annuity from Henry VIII of £10 for her services to the king and to the late Queen Jane. And
Mm,
I think the wording here may also suggest that because Henry VIII, took care of her, she was unmarried in 1542.
mm.
Perhaps she was his mistress. I think she may have been.
Oh, really? Well, there's a bit of gossip and scandal. Oh, how exciting! So I've potentially
Exciting.
got Henry VIII's mistress on my bedroom wall. Well, that's it.
Oh.
That's equally exciting. Anyway, I'd like to move on to another lady
Okay.
who I was fascinated by, and that's
Hmm.
Bridget Wingfield and her
Oh,
role
yes.
in Anne's story, because she doesn't just appear in Anne's story, she has a big impact. She has a big part to play in the downfall. So maybe you could give us a pen portrait sketch of who is Bridget Wingfield.
Okay. So Bridget Wingfield, she is Anne Boleyn's Kentish neighbor. She lived with her family in Stone Castle, which is just very close to Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's family home. And she was the daughter of John Wiltshire. And well, as you said, she had a big part in Anne Boleyn's downfall. And there's also this very tantalizing letter that Anne Boleyn
Mm,
sent to Bridget Wingfield.
yes.
She, basically, it's a very tantalizing letter.
Mm,
And it still survives the original. I've seen it. It's very beautiful. Anne Boleyn's handwriting always gives me goosebumps. And so in this letter, Anne Boleyn basically referred to Bridget's indiscreet trouble, which we don't know what it was.
mm,
Very
mm.
disappointing not
I
to
know.
know
I
what
mean,
they were referring to.
that's
I
so
mean, it was
exciting, is
obvious
it?
to them, right? But not to us.
Yeah. Yeah, indiscreet
um,
trouble. What an interesting phrase. It's like, it's not just
yes,
trouble, it's indiscreet trouble.
indiscreet. Yes.
That's the key word.
And yes, and in this letter, Anne Boleyn also says that next to her own mother, she knew no other women that she loved better than Bridget. So it's a testament, perhaps, if we take Anne Boleyn's word for it, if we believe her that she really loved Bridget, that they were close, that they were friends. And I was really interested in how do we know that they were close, or that the families were close. So luckily, very luckily, John Wiltshire's last will survives, and in this last will, he made Thomas Boleyn an overseer, which is a position of trust. It
Mm,
shows that they were friends, and also he left him a ring for remembrance. So again, we know, and we have evidence for it, that they must have been close. The families must have been close,
mm,
and also at some point in November, late November 1532, when Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were returning from Calais, they stayed at Stone Castle, so Bridget's home.
mm.
And, I would like to be a fly on the wall to know what they were talking about.
Yeah.
And, and again, Bridget is a person that we have bits and pieces of her life, and frustratingly, very little survives about her. We know that she was married 3 times. Her first husband was Richard Wingfield, and we kind of know her by his last name, so Lady Wingfield, and he was an ambassador. He served at the imperial court, and he died in Toledo in 1525. They had several children together, and these children are listed in his last will as well, where in this last will he basically charges Bridget Wiltshire again. He charges Bridget with, take care of their education. I know you will do a good job because you are virtuous and you will raise them virtuously. So again, this kind of evidence that she was,
Mm,
her husband thought highly of her.
mm,
Um, and he dies, so she remarries. Her second husband is Nicholas Harvey, and she had several children with him as well. Exactly how many, I don't know. Some sources say 4 children. Just in general terms, how many children Tudor noblewomen had is difficult to say, because some of the children died in infancy or were born dead. So
mm, mm.
we don't really have good evidence, because not every family had the list of the children born to them, but some families had like books of hours where they wrote in the margins, the dates
Oh,
of
yeah.
and the
Lovely.
order of the birth of their children. So that's very, a sweet way of commemorating their
Mm,
births
mm,
and deaths, also sometimes
mm,
tragically. um, so yes, Bridget, her second husband, Nicholas Harvey, he was also a strong supporter of Anne Boleyn. He was also an ambassador, and he died of the plague in 1532.
mm,
And when Anne Boleyn writes about his indiscreet trouble, perhaps that's just my guess, perhaps she was referring to Bridget's remarriage. Because we know that Bridget did remarry.
mm,
She married Robert Tyrwhitt.
mm,
And for all we know, they didn't have children together, but she died. Uh, some sources say she died in 1534, and she was certainly dead in 1536 during Anne Boleyn's downfall,
mm,
because the confession that we have, it's a deathbed confession, which is very strange. It's very strange.
mm.
Um, so she dies probably between 1534, because she's mentioned. Lady Wingfield is mentioned on the list of um, New Year's gifts of 1534. So perhaps it's her, but perhaps maybe not. We don't know. But she's definitely dead by 1536. So there's a lot of information about her, like these bits and pieces. We can see her story. We know who she was. We know that she was close with Anne, but the the details are lacking.
Am I right
Um,
in saying, because you've got to forgive me, because when I was writing out about her as a fiction writer, obviously
mhm,
rooting the story in fact, but nevertheless, as a fiction writer, you do have the ability to interpret events. And 10 years on, sometimes I forget which events I interpreted and which were actually based in fact. But I remembered the first two husbands very supportive of Anne. There's something that seemed that I remember, and this is a bit I'm not sure whether I made up as a fiction writer, that her third husband was less supportive of
mhm,
Anne. Now, was that
mhm,
just something that came out in my story, or is that a
mhm.
fact?
I think that you were influenced by the fact that Robert remarried, and his wife, I think was her name was Elizabeth. She was very strict in when it comes to religious views, and she also was, I think, Lady Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was later in the household of Lady Tyrwhitt
Mm,
after the Seymour scandal. So um, maybe that's where you took that, inspiration to depict that story, that relationship. But I don't know if Robert Tyrwhitt was or wasn't supportive of Anne. I think the connection that he had with his wife after Bridget
mm,
may point to the possibility that he wasn't very maybe supportive of the reform, but
yeah,
that's again
pro-reform.
that's just a guess, because people, even if they were not supportive of reform, they could have been friends, as is evidenced by, for example, Mary Tudor, Queen Mary the First. She was Catholic, but she was friends with Anne Seymour, who was a Protestant.
Yeah.
So interesting.
Yeah. And Thomas Cromwell, it turns out, from my interesting discussion with Dermot McCulloch, that's earlier this
Yep.
year. I think that was a bit of an eye opener, really. But okay, really good. And so I think we should just say for folk what actually happened, because you've
Okay.
touched on it, that there is this bizarre deathbed confession as Bridget obviously is dying, that gets dragged up at Anne's trial. So maybe you can give us a little bit of detail and your take on that.
Hmm. Okay, so the only story, the only source that says that Lady Wingfield was the informant against Anne is a note written by Judge John Spellman, who presided over Anne Boleyn's trial. And he wrote basically that there was this Lady Wingfield who died, but she made this confession before she died, and she shared the same tendencies as the Queen. So when we think about what this implies, the same tendencies, because Anne Boleyn was accused of adultery, of incest, of plotting the king's death. So I think this implies that maybe Bridget was um, known for having loose morals, or again, maybe that was said after her death to blacken her character.
Mm,
We don't know, because we don't really know that much about her. But Judge John Spellman says, well, Lady Wingfield is our informant. But frustratingly and puzzlingly, she is not mentioned uh, in other sources. So we have this John Hussey, who was the agent of the Lisle family, and he was at court very often. And he is at court in May of 1536. And he observes and he says, wow, everything was so discreetly spoken, I can hardly learn anything of substance. But he did write that the informants against the queen, so her first accusers, he actually uses that word, the first accusers, were Elizabeth Somerset, the
mm,
Countess of Worcester,
mm,
Nan Cabham, and one maid more. So he names three women. And he mentions no Lady Wingfield.
mm,
Interesting,
mm,
interesting. And there's also another source, which is this Lancelot de Carl. He was the secretary of the French ambassador, who was also at court at the time of Anne Boleyn's downfall. And he says that there was a lady who was reprimanded by her own brother because she apparently had a lover and she was married. So she was not supposed to have a lover. And she was pregnant. And she basically says, well, I'm not that bad. Look at the queen. She has a relationship with Mark, Mark Smeaton, the musician. And just that's how it all unfolds
mm,
later on,
mm.
according to the Carl, of course. So do we believe that story? Well, that Lady Worcester is again somebody who features in Anne Boleyn's story, but Lady Wingfield doesn't appear in anywhere other than John Spellman's note.
Yeah.
And also Chapuis, the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, says, well, during the trials, no witnesses were produced against either Anne Boleyn or her brother George. So that's strange, because that's the custom when a person denies their guilt. So nobody was really brought forward, no witnesses. And I think my personal belief is that, well, Cromwell didn't really have that much to justify the case, so he had to resort to a deathbed confession, if there ever was one, because I am skeptical that there was a deathbed confession by Bridget Wingfield.
Well, I mean, the woman isn't there to defend herself, is she? So, how
Exactly.
convenient.
How convenient that she's dead, right?
Quite. Yes, you definitely, I totally agree with you. I think that they were grasping at straws, and it was a rag bag of tittle tattle and gossip and fragments. And I mean, obviously, we know that the indictments place Anne in one place, and we know she was somewhere else. And there's actually really, I don't know whether you've ever read it, but if anybody's listening to this, there's a really interesting article written by some lawyers. I mean, this is about 30 or 40 years ago, but it focuses on the state trial of Anne Boleyn, and it's a really lovely legal dissection of treason trials of the time, and of that trial in particular. So it's well worth trying to seek out, and if I can, I might just put a link in the description below.
I think I know what you're referring to. I don't remember the names
No.
of the authors, but I think I've come across this when I was
Yes.
researching. So yeah, it's really interesting, because also when it comes to Anne Boleyn's downfall, I think that it wasn't really something that was planned by Cromwell for a very long time. I think the evidence shows that, well, Henry VIII wanted to annul the marriage, or divorce, annul, his marriage to Anne Boleyn. He was tired of her. She wasn't, as obedient as he wanted her to be. And also there was no son. So I think he wanted to annul. And of course, Cromwell started to looking into possibilities. There's evidence of that. And then, in late April, Anne has these strange conversations with Norris. She argues with him. She says, this comment about dead men's shoes. And she also reprimands Mark Smeaton. And if you look at the evidence, it's like Cromwell got his idea from there and accused Anne of
Just
all sorts of things
built it.
based on these conversations. So
Yeah,
that's
just
very
built it.
interesting. Yeah.
Woof, well, time is flying. We've been talking for nearly
My God.
45 minutes. I want to squeeze in one more scenario before we wrap up.
Okay.
And I want to jump to the end of Anne's story and talk about the ladies on the scaffold, because I think there's some evidence in the book, or that you've drawn out about who at least one of those ladies might be, because there's so much debate about that, isn't it? And were they young women? Were they friendly to Anne? Were they the women that had been looking over Anne during her imprisonment? What happened? So what's your take on all of that, and what did you find out through your research?
Okay, so when Anne Boleyn is arrested, she's accompanied by 4 ladies, and she says to William Kingston that Henry VIII knew exactly what he was doing when he put these ladies, whom she did not love, about her. And she really wanted to have ladies of her own privy chamber that she favored. And the ladies who were with her at the time, she was, Lady Kingston, so Kingston's wife, an obvious choice. She wasn't Anne Boleyn's supporter in any way. She was Catherine of Aragon's former lady in waiting. She was retired from court service. She was loyal to Lady Mary, and she also visited Lady Mary in late May. So following Anne Boleyn's execution. So I think Mary knew a lot about Anne Boleyn's last days, more than perhaps we do today.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so there was also Elizabeth Boleyn. So she was Anne Boleyn's aunt, the wife of James Boleyn, who was chancellor in Anne Boleyn's household. The Lady Coffin also, who was spying for Chapuis. I think for Chapuis, Chapuis says that he had one lady who was bringing him information, and I think it was Lady Coffin, because also Kingston says that she spied for him.
Oh,
So perhaps that was her.
okay.
And also one more lady, which is Mistress Stoner, I think.
Mm,
Not much is known about her. She may have been the mother of the maidens
mm,
at court, and if she was, then because later in the reign there is Lady Stoner, who is mother of the maids, so she's kind of this overseer of maids of honor at court. And if that's the case, then perhaps because of the nature of the accusations against Anne, she's placed there, as kind of, you know, a matron who would look
mm,
over the queen.
mm-hmm,
Who knows? But these women were not young. They were, I
mm,
think, by 16th century standards, already middle-aged. So in their late 40s, early 50s, to late 50s.
mm,
So not young in any way. But when Anne Boleyn was executed, she was accompanied by four ladies who, two eyewitnesses say, they were young. Were young. So um, there's interesting thing here. Did Henry VIII allow Anne Boleyn to pick the ladies that she favored? I think it's possible. I
I
think
do.
it's likely
Mm,
because of this, description of them as young.
mm,
And I think he did allow her to have her own the ladies that she favored. We don't know their names, sadly. They were not recorded for posterity. But in the British Library, there is a prayer book that Anne Boleyn had, and where she wrote this charming couple of verses to Henry VIII. By daily proof you shall me find to be to you both loving and kind. And they exchanged, these verses when they were during their courtship. And one of the maids of honor of Anne Boleyn, Bessie Holland, Elizabeth Bessie Holland, wrote her married name there, and her husband was also inscribed there in this prayer book. And so it's very interesting. Why would a lady who served as Anne Boleyn's maid of honor, because we know that she was present during Anne Boleyn's coronation in 1533. She was also later in Anne Boleyn's household. We know it. She's on the list of New Year's gifts. And also Chapuis mentions her as the Duke of Norfolk's mistress. And there's, this entire story of how Norfolk's wife detested Bessie, and so on
mm,
and so on. But this is,
mm.
very complicated story, maybe for another time. Um, and it's interesting because, we have this connection because Bessie was Anne Boleyn's maid of honor, and she did possess Anne Boleyn's Book of Vows. But just how, we don't know. Perhaps, perhaps, perhaps Bessie was one of the young ladies who accompanied Anne to scaffold, and that's how the prayer book was
Yeah.
in her possession later on. That's a speculation, of course, but I think it's highly likely that
Mm,
that was the case.
mm,
And again, it's something that when you think about it, um, not many sources mention that, about the prayer book, but it's there. Her name is there, and it was Anne Boleyn's book, so very fascinating. How on earth was that
abs-
connection made?
yeah.
Um, but if you look about it, like if you go further into this connection, then Bessie Holland, okay, so she was mistress of Norfolk, and that's how she became Anne Boleyn's maid of honor. I think that's my theory. But she's also very close to Mary Howard, Duchess of Richmond, so Norfolk's daughter, and to Mary Shelton, who was Anne Boleyn's cousin and also maid of honor. And they were these kind of close friends. So Mary Shelton and Mary Howard, for example, they contribute to the Devonshire
Mm,
manuscript. They
mm,
leave their inscriptions there, their names. They transcribe poetry. And Bessie Holland later on, she's also connected with Mary Howard. They are very close friends until the end. By until the end, I mean by the downfall of the Duke of
Yes,
Norfolk
right.
in 1547, late 1546, early 1547.
Mm.
And also she is still in contact with Mary Shelton all these years later,
Right.
because
Yeah.
Mary Shelton, interestingly, she leaves court service following Anne Boleyn's downfall,
Mm.
because I didn't find her in Jane Seymour's household. And also when Henry VIII was looking for a bride number 4 after Jane Seymour's death, there's this ambassador who says, well, the Duchess Christina of Milan kind of resembles one Mistress Shelton who used to serve Queen Anne. And I think that if Mary Shelton served also Jane Seymour, then that would have been reflected in the comment as well.
Yes.
So he would have said, oh, well, she was lady in waiting, maid of honor to Jane Seymour. But he says, one Mistress Shelton who used to serve Queen Anne. So I found that Mary Shelton, she left court. I think she was very disappointed because, again, that's fascinating story that, she was engaged to Henry Norris and Henry Norris was executed. So
Mm.
she loses not only her royal mistress, but also her
Mm.
fiance,
Mm.
the man she, perhaps maybe she loved him, maybe she didn't. We don't know exactly what relationship was there, but she loses 2 people actually.
Yeah.
So
And
interesting.
and that circle were about 10 years or so younger than Anne, so they were sort of a generation earlier, so hence they fit the description of being these, this young. I always thought of them as a young
Mhm.
and vibrant group, sort of growing up in the
Mhm.
influence of Anne Boleyn, who I think
Mhm.
probably deeply influenced them, particularly around religious thinking. And but
Mhm.
yeah, they seemed to, they're a very tight knit group, but they were all younger, weren't they? They were all quite substantially younger than
Well,
Anne.
you know what? We don't know when Anne Boleyn was born exactly, so
Ah,
that's difficult to make this kind of, I would think, theory
conclusion.
that they were so much younger. Conclusion, yes, so much younger. But uh, because they were maids of honor, so Mary Shelton was maid of honor, Mary Howard was maid of honor. Actually, with Mary Howard, we know that she was born around 1519.
Mm,
So we know that she was young. She
yeah,
was a teenager.
yeah.
So the description fits if we want to see her there, with Anne. I would think because Mary Howard accompanied Anne Boleyn in her triumphs from the very beginning, so it
Mm,
would have been very fitting for her to be with Anne at the very end. And also she was John Fox's informant, and he says that she was the one of the chief maids of honor who served Anne Boleyn. Um, so who knows, perhaps. But when it comes to, for example, Mary Shelton, we don't exactly know when she was born, but because she was maid of honor, she must have been in her late teens or
mm,
early 20s. Um,
mm,
so
mm.
I think she was younger than Anne, and she was also at some point Henry VIII's mistress.
Yes.
Um, she's another person who's very fascinating. I also wrote about her in my first book of the Forgotten Tudor Women series, because she was, the poet. She contributed to the Devonshire manuscript. She was Henry VIII's mistress, of course, at some point. And what I find very interesting is that historians usually confuse her with her sister because she had sister Margaret Shelton,
Mm,
and uh, it's often in Anne Boleyn's narrative you read that there was a Madge Shelton, a lady called Madge Shelton, but I found no such person in Anne Boleyn's household. No Madge ever appears as Anne Boleyn's maid of honor or lady in waiting, and I think that's again something that somebody wrote and others repeat that. And there was only Mary Shelton at Anne Boleyn's court. She's identified by name and her last name, Mary
mhm,
Shelton. She appears in William Latimer's Chronicle of Anne Boleyn's life that he presented to Elizabeth I. She also appears, her name is in the Devonshire manuscript, very beautiful, Mary Shelton signature. And so she is also, throughout Anne Boleyn's tenure as queen,
mm.
she appears very often. And she's again somebody who I find personally very, very interesting. And I like to believe that she was also with Anne Boleyn on the
At
scaffold,
the end.
perhaps That's my theory that Mary Howard, Mary Shelton, Bessie Holland, that perhaps they were with Anne. But that's just a third theory because the names of these women are not recorded.
Well, I hope so. And you mentioned a name of another lady that I absolutely adore, Mary Howard. I totally fell in love with her. I thought she was a fascinating
Me
character
too,
and
yes.
what an amazing life she has. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into it. Because we are coming
Oh
up
no.
we're coming
Oh.
up towards the hour. It's amazing. But I mean, you've given us a fantastic kind of insight into some of these, really fascinating women and the lives that they led and their relationship with Anne. And I'm sure it will have whetted people's appetite to know a lot more because there are so many other women that you include in this book. So
Yes.
folks, if you've enjoyed this, there's a lot more to learn, and I just really encourage folk to do that and to pay some attention to these women, because you will find it really enriches your enjoyment and your understanding of the whole story when you see it through that perspective.
Yes.
So maybe I'll just finish by asking you, one question. What did you really learn or take away from this that you hadn't appreciated before you started writing the book? It could be about a character, or it could be about a theme overall.
Well, I guess that when you think about Anne Boleyn, you think about her as being surrounded by men, she was accused of having this improper relationships with so many men, and uh, she was basically surrounded by women on a daily basis, and they knew about her. They knew everything that there was to know about her. So from the moment that she woke up in her luxurious four-poster bed to the moment that she retired to the same bed for the night, there were women about her. And I guess that it was impossible for a queen in Anne's position to commit all of those, um, adulteries without any of her women knowing. And that's again something that I think it's not highlighted enough in Anne Boleyn's story, that um, Cromwell later said to damn her, to blacken her, to destroy her reputation, that they were the women from her own household who came up with these accusations. But again, the evidence is very slim that they did.
Yeah, and also none of them
It
went to the scaffold like Lady Rochford.
Exactly, yes. Although the Spanish Chronicle says that there was this old lady who was burned as Anne Boleyn's accomplice, but Spanish Chronicle isn't really the most reliable of sources, but it is a reflection of gossip that circulated at court at the time. And also, when Anne Boleyn was arrested, the gossip spread that sundry ladies, so many ladies, were arrested with her. So that's what assumptions that people made, that she couldn't have been alone in committing these crimes, that she must have had some help. And the fact that she was executed without a lady, for example, like Catherine Howard, she had Lady Rochford who arranged the meetings with Thomas Culpeper, and she was also executed for that. So the fact that none of Anne Boleyn's ladies suffers for it, and what's more, that these women become Jane Seymour's ladies in waiting and maids of honor. That's fascinating, and
Yes,
that's
speaks a lot.
perhaps
Yeah.
speaks a lot. Yes. Um, um, you know, we have this evidence that Anne Boleyn's household was disbanded before her trial. So Henry VIII knew what he was doing there, didn't
He
he?
did. So in which case, all there is to ask you is remind us of the title of your book and where can people go to buy it?
So the title is Ladies in Waiting, Women Who Served Anne Boleyn, and you can buy it as paperback, as hardcover, as Kindle on Amazon. You can also get it from Book Depository. There's free shipping worldwide, so go and buy it if you like this conversation. Um, I guess
Absolutely.
I encourage you to read it, of course. I've enjoyed writing it. I've enjoyed researching it. I've enjoyed this conversation, Sarah, so much.
I have
So
to.
thank you for inviting me. Thank you for spending time with me. It was really lovely to
It
meet you, and
it was lovely.
so
I mean,
much
the
fun.
time has flown by, and I'm sure we could have spoken for
Yeah.
a lot longer.
Oh, whole day,
But
whole day.
we have to say goodbye, and we've got to leave something anyway for people to look forward to. So I'll
Exactly.
obviously put the title of the book and maybe the links to Amazon in the description associated with this podcast.
Okay,
But
thank
yes,
you.
folks, bear in mind it's not just in Amazon, and it's in a number of different places. So, but that's a
Yes.
starting point, at least people be able to see the
Mm-hmm.
cover of the book. Right. Well,
Okay.
with that, we're just coming up to the hour, so I'll say thank you, Sylvia. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.